Good morning to you, and thank you so much for finding time to be with me this morning. The show is Good Morning Africa. My name is Miriam Ogutu. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you tuned in and joining us from. I get to bring you the latest news from across the continent of Africa, and we start with the leading newspapers here in Kenya and the Daily Nation. The main headline: Baptism by fire as Ruto faces fuel crisis. The president had a busy day in State House holding meetings with foreign guests who attended his inauguration and witnessing the swearing-in of 6 judges his predecessor refused to appoint. He concluded with crucial talks to confront his immediate dilemma yet: how to check runaway fuel prices without a costly subsidy. And right now, the retail price for a litre of petrol is 179.30, and the cost of 2 kilogram of packet of unga right now retails at 250. And so, on the unga subsidy, President regrets that 7 billion Kenya shillings was gobbled up in 1 month through a failed pre-election program to reduce the price of flour. And then farm inputs pushed to ensure 1.4 million bags of cheap fertilizer are available next week to ease the burden of farmers. And on the pending bills, suppliers steeped in debt and whose lives have been ruined expect the government to speedily settle dues totaling 600 billion Kenya shillings. And on taxes, faced with rising expenditure and little financial wiggle room, new taxes that could raise the price of bottled water, juice and beer next month are inevitable. Very well. So who wanted her dead? That is a story on page 3. 6 promoted judges take oath of office. Judge Agri Muchelule, Justice Agri Muchelule, Justice George Odunga, Justice Joel Ngugi, Justice Weldon Korir, Justice Judith Omange, and Justice Makori Evans Kiago. That story is on page 6. The Standard newspaper, the main headline: fuel hits record high. Citizens will have to dig deep in their pockets for the next month after the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority increased the price of petroleum products a day after President William Ruto said the full subsidy Kenyans have been enjoying was not sustainable. The story is on page 8. And fears of maize flour shortage, that is on page 23. And Ruto fires tough warning shot on impunity, that is on page 4. Junet under fire from lawmakers. Azimio coalition party meets tomorrow to decide in its parliamentary leadership. However, MPs are expressing opposition to Junet's candidacy for any House leadership post. The story is on page 7. And fight to give men 91 days paternity leave. That story is on page 3. We turn our attention now to the Star newspaper. The main headline: Mudavadi to occupy Ruto's former office, and Deputy President Gachagua will take over 2 floors in the office of the president along Harambee Avenue. The story is on page 4. Woman rescued from Saudi Arabia gets scholarship, rejoins Meru University. The story is on page 2. President swears in, judges Kenyatta rejected, and that is the main pictorial on the front page of the Star newspaper. IEBC staffers on edge over links to Serena 4. A vicious war has rocked the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission over the bid to punish officers accused of colluding with the 4 commissioners who rejected the August 9th presidential election. The Star has established that the staffs are anxious they could be punished over their role in the polls. That story is on page 8. Family wants DCI to probe murder of its 2 sons. And that story is on page 9. And that is what we have on the front pages of the leading newspapers from Kenya this morning. So let me just bring us up to date with other newspapers from across the continent. And we start with the Daily Monitor. Museveni mounts new coffee charm offensive. That is the main headline. New vision. NRM releases cash for district officers. And The Guardian from the UK. People disappeared. Isium recalls horror of occupation. And amid the pageantry, the Queen takes place in history. That is what we have on the main headline on the Guardian from the UK. The Daily Telegraph also from the UK. Nations turn to say a farewell. The Citizen from Tanzania. Efforts to unlock private capital to get new impetus. Following renewed efforts to promote investment in Tanzania, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency pledged yesterday to expand its commitment to the government and investors to unlock private capital. That story is on page 2. A new envoy to Indonesia presents credentials. We have that there. And optimism as government meets with mobile operators over levies. That is what we have on the front page of the Citizen, and also ground handlers order to quit the new Zanzibar airport terminal by December 1st. Okay, and human traffickers to face a tougher penalties. You'll find all that on the front page of the Citizen newspaper from Tanzania. The Guardian, this is from, I think, Tanzania as well. Drug enforcers set to arrest, detain suspect. That is what we have there. The Daily News from Zimbabwe, indignation over brutal blackouts as fears grow that they could spark fresh price hikes. That is the main story. And Harare City in safe birth lift. The New Day from Zimbabwe itself, war vet demand Pali seats. Okay, and then SADC warming to Chamisa dialogue. Very well. The Guardian from Nigeria, energy crisis forces Nigeria's 43 million households to spend 8.9 trillion naira per year. It's that bad. Okay. So Southwest PDP resolves to back Atiku as Makinde insists IU must go. That is on page 6 on The Guardian. And Buhari's Imo visit, waste of resources, say citizens. And I think we were talking about this yesterday while President Buhari was there. I think he patted himself on the back and he said his government has done extremely well as far as developmental agenda and also tackling insecurity in Nigeria. But as I said yesterday, the jury is out there. The Nation, also from Nigeria, Makinde leads Southwest PDP on IU must go call. That is what we have. So Nigeria is readying for its elections next year, and also Zimbabwe is also readying to its elections next year. So a lot of political activities happening there, and realignments and things like that. So that is what we have on the front pages of the leading newspapers, some of them from the continent. So let's just get into the news before I bring in my panelists this morning, and we go to Egypt. The Al Jazeera television network has said that its journalist Ahmed El Nagbi has been released by the Egyptian authorities. The move comes as the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi visiting Qatar, where Al Jazeera is based, for the first time since the two countries restored relations last year after a long-running diplomatic dispute. Mr. El Nagbi has been held in preventive custody for 2 years. 3 of his colleagues remain in detention. The Egyptian government under President Sisi has targeted Al Jazeera over what it sees as the network's critical coverage. We head to Nigeria, and the National Human Rights Commission in Nigeria has paid about $700,000 in compensation to victims of police brutality. 58 people, mainly family members of victims of rights violations, were awarded varying sums. It follows investigations into complaints by families of victims who accused the police of extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, illegal arrest, and prolonged detentions, as well as illegal seizure of properties. The head of the Human Rights Commission, Tony Ojukwu, said the compensation payment is a gesture of apology to the victims from the government to acknowledge that their rights were violated. He noted that the cash payment should not be seen as representing the actual cost of the violations or harm suffered by the victims, explaining that the Commission's mandate is to protect the rights of Nigerians. In October 2020, police brutality and violation of human rights by the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, SARS, police unit triggered a nationwide protest with the hashtag #EndSARS. Kenya has severed ties with Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic (SADR). In a statement, the new President William Ruto and his government had embarked on a process of winding down the entity's presence in the country. He said the country supports the United Nations framework as the exclusive mechanism to find a lasting solution of the dispute over Western Sahara. This announcement came shortly after Mr. Ruto received a message from His Majesty King Mohammed IV No, the sixth, the King of Morocco, the leader of SADR, Brahim Ghali, was among those who attended William Ruto's inauguration in Nairobi on Tuesday. SADR has been agitating to transition from a semi-autonomous territory to self-rule, but Morocco has strongly opposed the proposal for the region to decide its future through a referendum. And I think the Sahrawi story, together with that of Biafra, together with that of Ambazonia, they all have similar, kind of agitations. So maybe in the coming days, I will just have a spotlight and just talk more about this story and now this new stand that the new Kenyan president has taken as far as that is concerned. All right, we move on to Ghana, and Ghana's economy continues to worsen by the day, which figures released by the Ghana Statistical Service painting a grim picture. The rate of inflation rose to 33.9% in August, up from 31.7% in July. The cost of housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels shot up by over 46%. Many are concerned things could get worse, as transport unions have also announced a 30% increase in fares with effect from next week. Some Ghanaians have attributed the economic situation to mismanagement and corruption, but the government insists it is due to the combined effect of the global pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ghana is now seeking a bailout package from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. More than 2,500 teaching and non-teaching education staff who had fled from their homes in the jihadist-hit northern Mozambique province in Cabo Delgado have returned to their homes due to the restoration of relative peace in the area. The provincial education official, Manuel Bakar, said some schools have reopened in the districts of Mosimboa, De Praia, Palma, Masumia, and Guisanga because of the return of the teachers. The area has been plagued by jihadist violence since 2017. Head over to Tunisia, and public sector workers are set for a 3.5% rise after the government reached an agreement with the Tunisian General Labour Union, sources have told the state news agencies. It will be spread all over a 3-year period as the country battles economic hardship. Tunisia is currently trying to obtain billions of dollars from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, in the form of a loan to help finance its budget. However, the financial body said the government needed to sign off a deal with the powerful UGTT before it will give the green light to loans, according to the Reuters news agency. The country is also facing a shortage of food in the shops. And we go back to Ethiopia. Tigrayan fighters in war-torn northern Ethiopia have lost control of a town near the region's borders with neighboring Eritrea, the commander of the soldiers has said. General Tadesse Worede has told a regional news station that joint Ethiopian and Eritrean troops had taken the town of Sheraro. Neither government has yet commented, and communications blackouts have made it difficult for the media to independently confirm the report. Sheraro is located some 50 kilometers from the border. General Tadesse also said government forces had taken control of Adi Ake, a town along the border between Tigray and its southern neighboring Amara that had been under the control of Tigrayan forces for more than a year now. Head over to Ivory Coast, and on Wednesday, the country accused Mali of blackmail over 46 Ivorian troops who had been detained by Bamako and called for the West African leaders to discuss the crisis as soon as possible. Mali's ruling junta last week tied the troops released to the extradition of Malians living in Ivory Coast, a condition that amounts to unacceptable blackmail, the government's National Security Council said in a statement. It reiterated a call for the soldiers' immediate release and urged a meeting of leaders of the regional bloc ECOWAS as soon as possible. The two countries have been locked in a diplomatic tug-of-war since July 10th, when the Malian authorities arrested 49 troops who had arrived at Bamako airport. The junta-led government said the troops had had no orders or supporting documents and described them as mercenaries. In August, the soldiers were charged with attempted harm to external state and security and formally placed in custody. Ivory Coast says the troops were simply on a routine rotation for personnel who provide backup services for the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali. We go back to Nigeria, and a 29-year-old Nigerian man has been interdicted by the U.S. for defrauding New York to the tune of $30 million in a September 9th, 2022 statement released from the U.S. Attorney's Office, Eastern District of Pennsylvania. Judozi Collins Obasi, who was charged by indictment with one count of conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud. The statement further reads that Collins is also facing 6 counts of mail fraud and 16 counts of wire fraud from a complicated involving fraud scheme that initially targeted Americans through a spam email campaign offering illegitimate work from home jobs. Collins is not alone in the operation. According to the statement, he has allies in Canada but has been coordinating the fraudulent activity from Nigeria. The FBI has begun a search for the young man, who is a fugitive, according to that statement. I tell you. Okay, we head over to Namibia, and the leader of Namibia's largest opposition party said on Tuesday he had written to Germany asking it for renegotiation of the genocide agreement reached last year between the two countries. A People's Democratic Movement (PDM) leader Marc-Henri Venani says he wrote to the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock last week, but is yet to get a response. In Namibia, Germany was responsible for massacres of the indigenous Herero and Nama peoples, which many historians consider the first genocide of the 20th century. In May 2021, after more than 5 years of bitter negotiations, Germany announced that it would recognize that it had committed a genocide in this southern African territory, which it colonized between 1884 and 1915, and promised development aid of $1.5 billion over 30 years to benefit the descendants of the two tribes. Germany stressed that the aid would be paid on a voluntary basis and that the agreement was not comparable to the reparations. Many Namibians rejected the agreement, saying the descendants of the Herero and Nama had not been sufficiently involved in the negotiations and that the Windhoek government had been forced to accept the text, which was presented to the Namibian Parliament a year ago, but has not yet been adopted. Crimes committed in Namibia during German colonization have plagued bilateral relations for many years. In a total, 60,000 Hereros and about 10,000 Namas were killed between 1904 and 1908. All right, and then we head over back to Mozambique, and the country's president, Filipe Nyusi, has called on Western energy companies to resume work in Cabo Delgado province, saying security has improved around the town of Palma, but clashes are continuing between federal forces and other African allies against Islamist militants. Addressing the Mozambican Gas and Energy Summit in Maputo on Wednesday, Mozambican President Filipe Nyusi assured Palma improved stability since the attacks on the towns of Palma. But insurgent attacks last week spread to Mozambique's northern Nampula province. Authorities say the militants attacked several villages, beheading 6 Mozambicans, killed an Italian nun, abducted 3 people, and torched scores of homes. The Islamic militants are linked to Islamic State and call themselves Al-Shabaab, though they have no direct connection to Somali's militant group by the same name. And then we end our bulletin this morning from South Sudan, and the head of the Continental Energy Firm is calling on the U.S. government to lift sanctions on South Sudan Oil and Gas Corporation to enable the country to develop the sector. N.J. Ayuk, executive director of the African Energy Chamber, said the sanctions are hindering foreign investment in South Sudan oil and gas projects, including the production of the natural gas. In 2018, the U.S. government imposed sanctions on 15 oil farms allegedly complicit in South Sudan conflict. The targeted sanctions affected 15 international and national oil companies and businesses, as well as some government units operating the oil sector. Sanctioned government institutions include the Ministry of Petroleum, Nile Petroleum Corporation, and South Sudan National Oil and Gas Company. Ayuk said foreign companies and governments find it hard to deal with the sanctioned institutions that were added to the U.S. Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security entity list. He said the companies must seek permission from the U.S. government to get specific license to do business with South Sudan. which I think is interesting, or risk being added to the same entity list, according to the group. The sanctions has not only crippled the sector but made it difficult for South Sudan to foster an economic growth and create jobs and business opportunities for its citizens. Ayuk, who spoke during the 5th South Sudan Oil and Power Conference in Juba, acknowledged that the U.S. sanctioned South Sudan because it was using oil to fund war. But he argued that if the sanctions were removed, it will help the country in building its capacity and developing gas to power program to minimize extensive energy poverty. And that is the end of the news from across the continent of Africa this morning. You are now up to date, and a very good morning to you with just about 24 minutes past 10 a.m. I'm joined by Samuel Tawish, a journalist and in-house analyst from here in Nairobi. Tawish, a very good morning to you.
A very good morning indeed to you, Miriam Ogutu, from our communication headquarters. Good morning to our viewers watching this program in Kenya, Africa, and the rest of the world. My great pleasure to join you on this program, Miriam.
All right, nice to have you. And I'm sure when I was just going through the news this morning, you were listening this story of South Sudan and how some of these farms have to get permission from the U.S. government before they can involve themselves in the oil sector in South Sudan because of the sanctions that were put in place. Apparently, South Sudan was sanctioned by the U.S. because it was using oil to fund war. I don't know, how do you look at this?
Well, Miriam, they usually say desperate times calls for desperate measures. And I think it is just appropriate that those sanctions were actually undertaken in as far as South Sudan is concerned. Because time without number, we have tried, the international community has tried, the regional organs have tried to intervene in the situation in as far as South Sudan is concerned. But we have never gotten a permanent solution to the crisis in South Sudan. And it's really appalling, Miriam, that at this particular time, the mineral resources, and in this case, the oil, which is supposed to benefit the populace in South Sudan, has become one of the biggest curses that we have in South Sudan. We all understand how South Sudan came to be. I remember when we had the referendum in 2011, there was this long agitation to actually separate or go separate ways with Sudan. And we thought probably the leaders who were pushing for that agenda had a better initiative, had a better plan for the people of South Sudan when they eventually decide to go separate ways. But it has now come to a full realization that it had nothing to do with the aspirations of the ordinary people, apart from just the interest of a few individuals, and in this case, the elite. Who continue to actually oversee the kind of torture, the maiming of innocent civilians, and of course the displacement of people in that particular country. So, I mean, it depends on how people are viewing it. I'm very sure the opinion is varied depending on where one sits as to why exactly we're having these stiffer sanctions and penalties being imposed on South Sudan. And I suppose then we should maybe implore on the international community and specifically the US to have specific sanctions directed at specific individuals or institutions that are not making it possible for the realization of the peace agreements and the peace treaties and for the people of South Sudan to go back to normalcy. So, Miriam, it is something that I'm sure people are not really having a very positive welcome in as far as what is happening in South Sudan is concerned. But I think it is one of those measures that we must accept are necessary, regardless, so that maybe the leadership in South Sudan can, by the end of the day, find reason to sit down together and be able to really pursue the necessary peace that the people of South Sudan have been yearning for all these years, Miriam.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you've rightfully mentioned, you said it there at Tawish, as much as, perhaps the U.S. felt this was the right thing to do. But of course, there are varied feelings over this because we've seen how sanctions has been used, especially in this continent, as a tool to, others will say control, as a tool to punish, as a tool to have the other countries submit and things like that. And in this regard, the U.S. government imposed sanctions on 15 oil farms allegedly complicit in South Sudan's conflict. But when you look at other countries, say like, Angola, when you look at other countries like with Equatorial Guinea, we know it has a bad record. It might not have an active conflict, but there are a lot of things that are happening in that country that are not okay. But you'll find that even the president and the vice president, who is the father and the son, own houses in places like the US. I was just watching another documentary weeks ago, and just closer to the White House, they're in Washington, and they own palatial homes in there. And we've seen the leading farms, in these countries that are known to be corrupt and has everything to do with oil. The leading companies, oil companies, are from the US. Even Mozambique right now, this story that I just read a while ago, the biggest company that benefits in that Mozambique, northern Mozambique, that has been plagued with conflict and all that, of course, that has to do with extremism, is the U.S. So when you look at oil and you look at South Sudan today, and we know the U.S. is one of the big financiers and aid givers to South Sudan, I understand their claims that a lot of the money that South Sudan was getting, of course, they couldn't account for, because we all know how South Sudan is right now. There's no structures for accountability, and it is ranked the world second most corrupt country in the world. And that is because of the war that has been continuing, and the situation that has not made it any better because of the leadership in that country. So I do understand that part, and they can't account for the money that they've been getting from the little oil that they've been selling outside. But don't you think this perhaps is being used as a tool for control? Tawish. Okay, I seem to have lost Tawish there. Tawish, can you hear me? All right, so I seem to have lost him there. But anyway, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. So I will not talk much about some of the news that I've just gone through there. But Tawish, can you hear me? Good morning.
Yes, Miriam, I can hear you.
Okay. So don't you think perhaps sometimes they use these sanctions as a tool for control?
Well, Miriam, observers and critics will want to advance that argument that perhaps U.S. is using these sanctions to try and maybe control or micromanage the affairs of sovereign nations in the African continent. To some extent, I agree, Miriam, but the question we should be asking ourselves is, how did we get here in the first place? Are we, as a people of Africa, are we as a leadership in Africa doing the right thing to be able to advance the democratic ideals, those that live to the expectation and aspirations of our people? The answer is absolutely no, Miriam. And as for the case of South Sudan, for instance, Miriam, we all know it's over about almost 13 or so years when we have been imploring on the leadership of South Sudan to try and put their self-interest aside for the benefit of the people.
Mm-hmm. We've lost you there. All right, we're having a bit of a trouble with Samuel Tawish. Once he's able, you can let me know when you fixed that. Yeah, and I think he brought up the issue of democratic ideals. I don't know what democratic ideals exist in Saudi Arabia. We know what they're doing right now, a lot of allegations, and what they're doing in countries like Yemen, but still the US has no problem trading. I mean, they killed that journalist Khashoggi, who was also a US a US citizen, and the prince acknowledged that, but the US didn't do anything. Still, Saudi Arabia remains one of the countries that they supply with arms, the key leading country. So I don't know if democratic ideals, I think sometimes they just choose and pick how they implement these sanctions. Would you like to complete your thought process, and then we just move on to our topic of discussion this morning?
Sorry, Miriam, I just got an interruption from a call right from
It's okay.
Actually, from Dr. David Masanga, I was just trying to inquire about the program you're having.
Yeah.
Miriam, I think generally what I was trying to say is that much as we disagree with these sanctions, because by the end of the day, they tend to affect the lives of the ordinary mwananchi. And in South Sudan is no exemption, Miriam. But again, like I've said earlier, what is the leadership of this particular country doing, or the leadership in the African continent really doing to avert some of these cases? Because, Miriam, we continue to blame the West, we continue to blame the international community, but more often than not, we've even seen ourselves really implore on them, put petitions even to the international community and international organs to try and intervene, and sometimes even call for severe measures or mechanisms to try and maybe put some sense into the leadership that is actually perpetuating this kind of activities in the African continent. So, but when they take that action, the people of Africa are the ones again at the forefront, coming to place or lay blame on the international community. So, doing the right thing, Miriam, does not necessarily require or does not require the intervention of the international community to come and dictate to us what is right or what we should do right for our people. So I want to pursue and expect that in as far as the sanctions are concerned in South Sudan, that if these sanctions are going to affect the lives of the ordinary, or the livelihood of the ordinary monarchy, then I think it is time for the US or even other concerned organs of the international community to be able to review these sanctions so that they are not actually targeted the ordinary monarchy, because by the end of the day, they are still vulnerable. They continue to face the same challenges they continue to face. Yet the people who are perpetuating these acts of violence and, of course, a lack of peace and security in this region are living large in palatial homes, like you put it. Some of them even do not live in South Sudan for that case. So if you put sanction on some of the critical areas of economy in a country like that, in a country that is in dire need of uplifting in terms of economy, then you'll be putting the lives of the ordinary monarchy into more danger. So I think it is moment for us to implore on the international community to see into it what will be another best alternative or best approach to.
All right, thank you so much. We apologize for that. We had lost you there for a couple of seconds, and so, but that's okay. Thank you so much. Your point is home now. So let's just move on to our topic of discussion this morning. That is Somalia and peace. President William Ruto met Somalia's President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud on Wednesday as part of efforts to boost bilateral ties and enhance security between the two neighboring countries. President Ruto said their discussion mainly featured the security situation in Somalia and the Horn of Africa. Both Somalia and Kenya have suffered the brunt of terrorist attacks from the Al-Qaeda-linked militant group Al-Shabaab, who have continued to pose terrorism threats in the region. On Tuesday, Somalia's president pledged to continue working closely with development, regional peace and security, and other areas of mutual benefit between the two countries. And Kenya is among the countries whose troops are serving in Somalia under the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia ATMIS umbrella. Now, the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, or ATMIS, is an active African Union transition and drone mission from peacekeeping operations in Somalia, formerly the African Union Mission to Somalia. ATMIS's mandate will end in 2024 with full transition of security operations to the Somali National Armed Forces. ATMIS consists of troops from the East African nations of Burundi, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. So, Tawish, I know it, before ATMIS came into place, we did have the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, that is the AMISOM, which was formed, ATMIS was formed in the 1st of April 2024. But before that, there was AMISOM, whose mandate ended on the 31st of March. I don't know if somebody can ask you, because this is a conversation we've had for a very long time on this platform. If someone was to ask you that some of the things that you can see, the tangible results from the AMISOM in Somalia, I don't know if you're able to pick one.
One, Miriam, that is quite obvious is that there's some semblance of peace and tranquility, and also a restoration of security situation in as far as Somalia is concerned, because the situation as it is today cannot be said of the same about 5 or so years ago before the intervention by the AMISOM. And it's a region and part of the African continent, Miriam, because again, it is in the understanding of the neighboring countries and the region at large that failure to have security stabilized in Somalia really will have a ripple effect onto the neighboring countries. And just like you've alluded to, Miriam, Kenya is one of those countries that have suffered the brunt of terrorism attacks in the previous years. And it was only wise and prudent for Kenya and the rest of the African countries, the neighboring specifically, to really send the troops into Somalia. Today, you cannot say the kind of terrorism activities that used to occur, not only in Somalia, but also in the neighboring countries like Kenya, for example, in Tanzania, in Uganda, in Burundi. I mean, it was more like becoming, a new normal. That every other day you wake up, you find that there's actually a bomb attack, there's a terrorist attack somewhere in a hotel, in a school, in a church, and it became more like usual for us. And I think with this kind of intervention, we are seeing that there's a restoration of security and peace in that region, and there is a reduced, if no attack completely, in the neighboring countries, is particularly speaking for Kenya. And therefore, Miriam, I want to laud that effort by AMISOM and now ATMIS, just like you've mentioned, because again, after all this endeavor, after all these activities, initiative to pacify Somalia, we also needed to have time, like Dr. Masanga usually puts it, a moment to do fatigue evaluation, a moment to do a review or an audit of how we have performed this far. And of course, there were also timelines that within a given period of time, AMISOM really had to exit Somalia so that eventually we can allow the people of Somalia to be able to carry on with the activities. You cannot imagine, Miriam, that just a few months ago, we had an election in Somalia where, a very peaceful election for that matter, where a new president was installed democratically. What does it tell you? We could not have the same, say previously, because of the insecurity situation in Somalia. Today, the AMISOM and, of course, alongside the U.S. Forces have been able also to train the soldiers in Somalia, in that they are able now to continue, of course, with the ongoing security pacification of that particular region. So you'll quite agree that there's tremendous achievement that has been realized because of the intervention by AMISOM and the continued stay of now ATMIS to oversee the transition. That is, I think, up to 2028, if I'm not very wrong, is when they are supposed now to have full exit from Somalia. That way we'll know that we will now be very confident that Somalia and the Somalia's peacekeeping mission has been a success, and the people of Somalia can now be able to go back to their businesses. They can be able to go back to do cultivation of crops and trade with the rest of the African continent, if not the world, for the betterment of that particular young nation in the African continent. So yes, there's been a lot of achievement and successes in as far as the intervention by AMISOM and now ATMIS is concerned in Somalia. I submit.
Okay, so the ATMIS mission is focused on both military and institutional autonomy of the Somali government. As the African Union pulls out, the mission's mandate is set to end on the 31st December 2024, when Somali security forces are expected to fully take over the security responsibility of the country, guided by the Somali Transition Plan. The first reduction of troops to ease into the end of the peacekeeping mission will take place in December 2022. So they'll start pulling out Tawish, and I think the mandate will end in December 2024. And of course, there has been some very uncoordinated responses in regards to this matter as far as the government of Somalia is concerned. We saw on April 6th, 2022, just after the elections, the Prime Minister of Somalia, then Mohamed Hussein Roble, ordered the African Union ambassador to Somalia, Francisco Madeira persona non grata, to leave the country within 48 hours because of engaging in acts that are incompatible with his status, after an audio emerged of him criticizing government officials for not dealing with the national security problems, kind of like what we do here every day. And the president of Somalia, Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed, a major critic of Prime Minister Roble, immediately rejected the expulsion. So the Prime Minister said, no, you can't be criticizing us. From the position you're holding in this country, you're not supposed to be talking in that manner, so you are not supposed to be here. And you have 48 hours to leave. And the president said no. whatever this person was caught or allegedly caught in the audio saying, I think could have some truth in that. So he stays, he gets to stay. So when you look at the division within the leadership of Somalia there, that perhaps immediately tells you that when it comes to matters security, I think depends on your interest, and then you can take a position on that. And after President rejected the expansion, and on the 16th of April 2020, plans for a new African Union ambassador to come to Somalia to replace Francisco Madeira began after the controversy that soured relations with the Prime Minister. And on May this year, Al-Shabaab jihadists armed with guns and explosives stormed ATMIS base in El Baraf, Middle Shabelle region, triggering a fierce firefight, killing 30 soldiers and wounding another 22 Burundian peacekeepers, according to a high-ranking Burundian military officer. A dozen soldiers were also declared missing. This was the first ever attack on ATMIS since taking over AMISOM on 31st of March. So when you look at the structure and just the psychology as far as the conflict in Somalia is concerned, Tawish, and this has been my opinion, and maybe you can correct me. I feel like as much as there has been some efforts from the stakeholders from outside Somalia, and the efforts we've seen now through AMISOM, through now ATMIS, and other countries have been there, like the US, which has done, I think, a tremendous job in helping and aiding in fight against Al-Shabaab, and other stakeholders have been there helping Somalia. But until the people from the inside and the leadership start speaking in one voice and start looking at the security threats and addressing the issue, Al-Shabaab from one standpoint, and then the efforts that are being made by these other partners might not amount to much, because from where I sit, I feel like the solution has to come from within the Somalia leadership, so that the rest of these other stakeholders can just support and back that up. What do you think?
The major setback, Miriam, in achieving all this has been, of course, the conflicting interest coming from the leadership also in Somalia. And I think it is not a unique situation to Somalia only. I think in most cases, wherever you have such kind of situations happening in the country or in various countries in the world, you will notice that there's a leadership that will want the status quo to be maintained. They will want the kind of insecurity probably to persist, so that maybe through the same they can be able to pursue their own self-interest, and maybe those of their proxies or the people who are working with them, to ensure that through the lack of security, the lack of peace, then they are able really to pursue successfully their self-interest. I think that has been the major challenge in Somalia. That's why you see even the immediate former president and the new president in Somalia were not always reading from the same script. We all know that, and even the prime minister himself was not reading from the same script with the president then. But you can see there's a new lease of life in as far as how Somalia is handling issues today with a new president in place. You even saw the president, that is Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, really having a bilateral talk with the president of Kenya, that is Dr. William Ruto, just the other day. And it does tell you the kind of attention, the kind of interest that the new president in Somalia really has to make sure that the long time ties that Somalia and Kenya have enjoyed are restored, and even those that had been severed really can be brought back. Remember the issue of the maritime dispute between Kenya and Somalia. It had almost threatened to bring a very major animosity and breakaway between Kenya and Somalia. And in itself, Miriam, also, it was threatening the continued pacification of Somalia, because to some extent the Kenyan troops have contributed largely in trying to restore the peace and security in Somalia. So I agree. The kind of the kind of self-interest that some politicians and some leaders are normally pursue in such kind of situations could lead to varied reactions and varied opinion, in as far as of course interventions are concerned. And we've seen that from Somalia. And in fact, there was a time even they were blaming Kenya for engaging in illicit trade. You remember the issue of sugar, you remember the issue of charcoal, and all manner of accusations being really put on the on the heads of missions in as far as the operation in Somalia is concerned. It was a whole strategy and orchestrated plan to try and bring about a fiasco and confusion into this particular intervention and initiative to restore peace in Somalia. So I think today we are very happy, we are glad that we have a new leadership in place, a leadership that appears to be very focused on not only rebuilding Somalia, but making sure that in the process of rebuilding Somalia, they also restore of course, the diplomatic ties with the neighboring countries, if not the entire globe. And because there's no country, there's no nation, there are no people that can live as an island, Miriam. And I don't think that Somalia is an exemption in as far as this is concerned. Somalia today, regardless whether the AMISOM has exited Somalia, whether ATMIS will exit Somalia, by the end of the day, they will still need Kenya, they will still need Burundi, they will still need Tanzania, Uganda, and the rest of the world for them to be able really to engage and do trade and business with the rest of the world. They cannot really isolate themselves and think like because now peace has been restored, the region has been pacified, that they can be able now to carry on with the activities without necessarily the help of other partners in the world. So that is very critical and essential. And I think now with that leadership, a new dawn must really must reign on the leadership and the people of Somalia to understand why they need the rest of the partners for them to now continue the effort of rebuilding Somalia.
Okay. And speaking about the efforts of rebuilding Somalia, I think there's a point there you talked about the conflicting interest that we've seen there being exhibited in the Somalia leadership. I don't know, can you speak a bit about that conflicting interest and the foreign interference that sometimes, backs this conflicting interest? Because we've seen that play out even in the maritime dispute between Kenya and Somalia. Within that case, we know there are other countries outside of Somalia and outside of Africa that really were pushing even Somalia to take Kenya to the ICJ, and that will be Norway and even Britain itself. The UK was supporting Somalia in that, and other countries, because as you know, as Somalia starts to stabilize a little bit, they still have a long way to go, but we can all admit that it's not as bad as it used to be. They're making a bit of progress, baby steps, but I think they're heading towards the right direction, if I can just put it like that, because they're not where they used to be. And so this presents a lot of opportunity as far as reconstruction, as far as putting up industries, as far as exploring the natural resources. So all these other foreign interests are really posturing themselves and hoping that immediately the guns are silenced and Al-Shabaab is a thing of the past, they can come in and take up these opportunities that are currently presented in Somalia, or will be possible after Somalia really regains itself and has peace. So the foreign interest, would you think it has been a major obstacle as far as as far as a peaceful Somalia is concerned?
Absolutely, Miriam, I tend to agree with you because again, Miriam, when you talk about the conflict of interest, remember Somalia is one of those nations, young nations for that matter, one which has rich mineral resources. You talk about oil, you talk about the gas, you talk about the fishing industry, and with all this, you're talking about wealth. And most of the Western power countries, they would rather have their merchants really continue to perpetuate the kind of instability that we have been witnessing in Somalia, so that through the same they can continue oppressing the people of Somalia, or better still, to continue exploring the resources for the benefit of the Western power conspirators and not for the benefit of the natives in Somalia. And I think that is why you see we cannot have a complete end to the kind of vicious cycle of course, insecurity in Somalia. And this is not unique to Somalia. I mean, most of the African countries, so to speak, today. So in that case, Miriam, when you have the international community, or you have a section of the Western power nations that are so much keen into extracting or exploiting the rich mineral resources in some of these countries, they'll do whatever it takes, including using their merchants and their proxies in these nations to oversee the status quo, or to see into it that the people can continue fighting as they continue exploiting the resources that will otherwise be beneficial and helpful for the uplifting of the livelihood of the people in that particular nation, Miriam. You know the adage that a house divided cannot stand. And Miriam, if you cannot stand, then it becomes very easy for the enemy, quote unquote, to be able to exploit you. And so if the people of Somalia were to continue fighting each and every day, at what time, at what point will they really be able even to sit down and concentrate and see how can they be able to build factories, say for example the fishing industry, how can they be able to exploit the rich gas industry, how can they be able to exploit the oil industry for the benefit of the people of Somalia. It is not possible, Miriam. And so it is only in the interest, it is in the good interest of the Western power conspirators to continue using the merchants in Somalia, to continue to using the excuse of the war in Somalia. And also you remember when they are trying to wage a war between Kenya and Somalia in as far as the maritime dispute is concerned, because they know that Kenya was getting into Somalia with a goodwill, with a good gesture, just with the interest of making sure that Somalia is pacified in as far as peace and security is restored in Somalia, so that the people of Somalia can now go back to their home. There are so many people of Somali origin, really, who are living in Kenya as immigrants, or living here as refugees in Kenya. Talk about Kakuma and Dadaab camp. They are there in hundreds of thousands, and it is only better that Kenya pacifies Somalia so that these people can go back to their nation and also, undertake education, can get back to building their industries and build up that young nation into a prosperous nation and a better nation for the other generations that will come after it. So I think the Western power nations, especially those who have had interest in these very critical sectors, have not done as much to help pacify Somalia, or even the efforts that we have seen coming from the regional organs, like, for example, IGAD and others, to see into it that Somalia is finally at ease and at peace with itself. So, yes, Miriam, but how can we be able then to avoid all this? I think the issue of over-reliance on aid and foreign donation has been a major hindrance to our development and growth as a continent of Africa. The moment we realize that we need to utilize our own resources, to utilize our own manpower, to utilize our own ability and capacity, and that which God has bestowed unto the African continent, the better for us. We'll be able to do things for our own. We'll be able to fend for our own, African men and women, instead of the over-reliance that has become more of a norm to our people and to our leadership. That in itself has really compromised our dignity, has compromised most of our ideals, and we continue but to lie low and nail onto the Western power countries for us to get sometimes even a meal. That is very disastrous, Miriam.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you so much. And I was just reading a very interesting piece on the Al Jazeera network this morning, and I've heard about the parallel judicial systems that are run in Somalia by the areas that Al-Shabaab are controlling. They do have their own judicial systems in southern and central Somalia, and they do also have mobile courts in territories held by the government. And the sessions are only attended by the complainant, the defendant, witnesses, and other petitioners present at the time of hearing. And they don't seek any payment. Instead, if you file a case, instead the group usually makes its income, from zakat and obligatory given by businesses and property owners. That's how they fund, of course, by other funders. Or it has been established outside of Somalia. Some countries are funding that. So the understanding behind this, you'll find that even just normal Somalis who do not support the Al-Shabaab find it viable to visit these courts that are run by the Al-Shabaab, because they feel they'll get justice there. Because if you were to go to a normal judicial process according to the constitution of Somalia, then you're not likely to find justice there. That is the feeling of many Somalians, because they feel the judges are compromised, and a lot of times they make judgments based on clanism, because that is really a thing as far as Somalis politics is concerned. And now I'm learning even as far as the judicial process is concerned, and usually you have to pay so much looking for a lawyer, and even just, it's a corrupt system. So a lot of people, find it necessary to just go to these, Al-Shabaab courts to find justice, which I found to be very interesting. And so they do have what they call, according to the people who believe in them, the Somalis who believe in these courts, they look at Al-Shabaab as having a higher moral high ground. Can you imagine? So in conclusion, I think the Somali government and the new leadership has a lot of house cleanup to do in Somalia. So that's what, when we were starting this conversation, I said, as much as the rest of us and other stakeholders are out there trying to stabilize Somalia, but Somalia has a lot of cleanup to do in its own internal affairs, so that these are the things that are being worked out, and stability can finally come to Somalia, but they still have a lot to do in that country. So thank you so much, Samuel Tawish, for your time this morning, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you later on with more discussion from across the continent of Africa. My name is Miriam Ogutu. It was a pleasure to have you this morning. Good morning.